Hey everybody, welcome to Unit 19. Things now have just got a little bit dark. That's right, we're going to be looking at what I call the dark side of economics. Some of the areas where economics may not be applied in a particular way to our advantage, where it's getting abused for the benefit of the few. And this might be tough to swallow, but I'm going to get right back into it right now. So where shall I begin? There's a lot of areas where I can begin. I want to talk about investment, and government investment in particular. A lot of countries have a government that have a reasonably large budget, and they use that budget to get certain things done. But do they necessarily get the things done that need to be done? I worked in the government for quite a long time, for about 10 years. I can sort of tell you that's not necessarily the case. There's certain projects that have more appeal, certain projects that are being used to possibly garner support in areas where the particular parties need that support, and this investment gets pushed through. It may not be the investment that's most beneficial to the people, but it's most beneficial to the government themselves, and especially when it comes down to getting re-elected. There's also the bureaucrats as well that work for the government, and a lot of them have a particular interest about getting their projects funded. As more funding means more money for them, and in a sense, if you're a public servant, you want to have more funding, you want to have more money, you want to have more power. That often leads to projects, the benefits of projects being overestimated, and the cost of not having the project potentially vastly overestimated as well. So, for example, we can talk about the situation of congestion as I've worked in roads, and the extent of future congestion could be quite easily exaggerated in order to make a project look better. So let's say, for example, you have traffic growth of 3-4% consistently. That could be assumed to continue, which would lead to potentially very disastrous consequences. Of course, in the real world, people's behavior modifies. People change their behavior under certain circumstances, and a vast amount of congestion would change people's behavior, and they would change their travelling patterns. Often that's not always considered in the economic analysis, and it often leads to projects looking rather favourable and therefore obtaining particular funding. This may not seem a particularly stand out as a particularly bad thing, but you have to bear in mind the amount of money that goes into some of these projects and initiatives. There are many billion-dollar projects, and if we have, several billion-dollar projects getting funded a year that shouldn't, that is a very big drain on your money. Remember, the government are using your money to fund these projects, and that's something to be aware of. When you see some big overpass being built, is it really for your benefit, or is it for the benefit of the bureaucrats? Is it for the benefit of the politicians that are still in power? Some projects genuinely need to be built, and it's not every single one is a bad one, but that's something to be aware of, especially when you look at investment decisions. Next one I'll talk about is the banks, and I've talked about money and I've talked about monetary policy a few times earlier, but there's a real problem in regards to banks creating money, especially if it goes unchecked, especially if more and more money is being printed. And you get a situation where you get inflation. Sometimes it's not always particularly noticeable. Again, inflation can be manipulated depending on how the basket of goods is measured. Like, take for example, your fuel is often not included in that basket of goods, which determines your inflation. So anyway, going back to money supply, as more and more money is supplied into the market, your wealth is diluted. Take for example, you have $10 and the total money supply is $100. You have 10% of the money supply, 10% of the wealth. If that was to increase to $200 and you still have your $10, you now only have 5% of the wealth. The wealth hasn't necessarily changed in terms of what's out there. Physical assets could very well be the same, but your share of it has been reduced because money has been created. Money that's coming out of central banks that are going straight to the government in a lot of cases. So that's diluting your wealth. And if you're someone who's been working all of your life, earning a salary, that dilution of wealth greatly affects you, and it greatly affects your savings and all that work that you put in over the years. And that's one of the very harmful effects of inflation. But creating money supply is also a solution to many of the government's problems, so therefore it is a popular option for them to take, though it's not in the best interests of a lot of people. I'd like to talk about scarcity now. And this is an interesting topic because it's described as a fundamental problem of economics. I see scarcity as something that certainly affects the price and the quantity of things produced, because if there's a scarcity of something, that pushes the price up. And often scarcity is to the benefit of the producer. It allows them to charge a higher price. It makes the demand, you say, more inelastic. If there's limited choice of something, if there's only one supplier, for example, you can't go elsewhere, so you have to end up buying from that same supplier. And oil is a good example of that. We've seen so many wars where the supply of oil has been greatly reduced and the price of oil greatly increases, and that is the benefit to those that hold the oil, because they're getting more money for that oil and they're making larger profits. So scarcity is something often what I call as contrived scarcity, and it's used to manipulate the price and transfer more money to the rich. And this isn't just done by private companies, it's often done by the government, especially when they're waging wars on other countries, especially the oil producing wars, and they're creating this scarcity. And we've seen a lot of countries suffer because of very bad foreign policy that's resulted in them being unable to trade, create even more scarcity for food in some cases, where countries actually do not have enough food, and scarcity can be a real problem to them. So if you're thinking about your government actions, think about the foreign policy of your governments and what they're doing to other countries and how they may be creating scarcity to the benefit of a few people. Next area I'd like to talk about is mortgages and debt. That's right. So many of you may own a house, many of you may be living in rented, but even if those of you that actually own your house, there's a good chance you don't own it outright. You may be paid a deposit and you owe the rest of it to the bank that lent you the money. And what's a real big problem these days is people owe so much money. And housing is a real problem because a lot of banks are allowing people to buy houses with a very low down payment. That makes houses more affordable to more people, which causes an increase in the demand for houses, which causes an increase in price. So therefore, if you want to buy a house, if you're a young person and you want to buy a house, you don't have an awful lot of money. The only way you're going to be able to do that is by borrowing a lot of money. If you choose not to borrow a lot of money and live in rented, the increase in the house prices because of these movements by the banks, the house prices keep going up, so the demand for houses keeps going up, especially as an investment. People see house prices going up, they pump more and more money into houses. You end up with a lot of people owning lots and lots of houses, and a lot of other people not owning any houses at all. So if you don't get into the housing market early enough, then you may never be able to get in. And if you do get in, you end up paying a high mortgage, having a high amount of debt. And debt doesn't just extend just to housing, it extends to a lot of other things as well. Many consumer durables are bought on hire purchase simply because people do not have enough money to meet their wants. And people's wants are often exaggerated, by advertising, by the media, and so on, Keeping up with the Joneses, I think is one of the phrases they use. And all this consumerism is resulting in even more debt. And what that means is that basically you are living on debt, you're living on having to make these repayments, and that puts you in a bad position, especially if you have a job. You're going to be stuck at that job simply because you can't afford to leave, you can't afford to get out of the job simply because you won't have the money. You end up living from paycheck to paycheck. It's not a particularly good way to live, considering how this world has evolved with the amount of technology and the amount of time-saving things that we have, that you end up having to give your whole life to work, simply because you need to pay that debt. Okay, I'm going to end this unit here. Hopefully I haven't brought your spirits down, but there's a lot of things to think about when we look at the world. A lot of things that are done in a particular way that's not always great for us, and it's very important that we acknowledge that and recognize that, and also understand how economics is often used to work against us, and often used by particular people to increase their power and their strength. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that in the next unit, which I'm also still going to be on the dark side of economics, so We've got a lot more to cover in that area, so stay tuned. And also remember, I've got 3 questions for you to answer as well. Catch you soon.